Hi, everyone. What I want to talk about today is, and you've heard me reference this and talk about this in other videos and other places, but I want to dedicate some time to specifically to talk about how we think about and how we go about examining religion. Religion is a big part of not just our course, but the way in which all the people we have to interact in society. In a global economy, it's likely that you're going to either have to interact with people of a different religion than you, or people who are highly religious and you're not. Either way, these are, we really want to have the tools with which to think it through and think about what religion does for people, how are the ways they engage it, what are the components of that, and why certain things about it can be so important. First, I want to talk about what religion is. Religion is the service of or interaction with the divine through a system of attitudes, beliefs, and practices that are maintained within a given community. Now, that sounds kind of generic, but the simple truth is that it's service with, it's interaction with or service of divine. Okay, so a divine or supernatural, basically anything that's superhuman, that's outside of normal human experience, or those can be not just gods and spirits, but those can also be deceased ancestors or anything that is just outside of what we have the normal human experience is. And so what will happen is that a community will develop over time a system, a integrated system of attitudes, beliefs, and practices for that interaction with the supernatural, with the spiritual, with gods or God, if you're for the monotheisms of the world. And they'll develop a system that is maintained within that community, so that people know that that system kind of defines that community. It kind of is part of their identity. For that reason, oftentimes many people have the mistaken idea that religion is all about your personal beliefs. It's really not. In many cases, in a lot of places around the world, religion isn't just about one's personal beliefs. It's the way also that a community is bound together. People don't just believe, they also belong. And believing and belonging can be basically two sides of the same coin. And so that's why it's important to kind of understand this and be able to wrap your mind around that, because this idea that a person can exist without religion is both a recent idea in the history of humankind, and also a minority view. It's something somewhat rather Western. Anything venture outside the United States, or specifically venture outside of kind of like a white European heritage, you find that people still are highly religious, and that's depending on the religion of the region, they can be highly embedded into their culture, and it's the manner in which they are bind each other together. And so you'll no more pry their religion away from them than you would pry family members and tribes apart. So it's important to understand or get into it why it is it's so important and what are the elements of it. So in religion, that system of interacting with or serving the divine, interacting with the spiritual or service of the divine, has multiple elements of it. And all those elements center around things that are sacred. Now, what do we mean when we say sacred? Well, the word sacred really comes from a Latin term of just sanctified or sacrosanct, or something that is set apart. The idea that is set apart for distinct use. Kind of a more mundane equivalent to that would be, say, my backyard. I mean, front yards typically don't have fences, but my backyard has a fence around it. Why does a backyard have a fence around it? Because it's set apart for my use. It's not front yards. People walk through those all the time, and different stray dogs or whatever. But if I see anything foreign in my backyard, that will be a cause of concern. And that's true for a lot of homes, a lot of houses. I even see that throughout Mexico and other countries I go to, where people will have a place that is set apart for them, for their use. And so if it's set apart for their use, it's somewhat, to put kind of a secular spin on it, it's sacred to them, air quotes, sacred to them, meaning it's set apart for their use, it's not for common use. So if you're going to differentiate things that are sacred versus common, something that is set apart for spiritual use, or something that is set apart for ritual use or divine use, those things we would consider to be sacred. And so with that understanding of things that are sacred, set apart for divine use or religious use of some type, we can identify six different elements of the sacred, six different sacred components of religions that tend to be, I won't say totally universal, but they are common enough that when you are encountering a communal, cultural understanding of the divine, the supernatural, more often than not, you are interacting with people whose religion incorporates these six different elements of the sacred. And so just about any religion, this is going to be true, not just my Christian tradition, but say Muslim traditions and Hindu and Buddhist and other different types of religions and traditions throughout the world are still going to have these six elements of the sacred. More often than not, that's is what you'll find. And they're all going to be different. These six elements of the sacred are all going to be different for every religion, but they will all have them. So, and those six elements are the sacred space, sacred times, sacred rites, R-I-T-E-S, sacred rites, sacred offices, sacred objects, and sacred myths. Now let's talk a little bit about each of those. First of all, sacred space. Well, what is sacred space? Sacred space is space that is set aside for ritual or religious use. It's not like every other space. It's, if we're going to differentiate the sacred versus the common, it's space that is set apart for interacting with the spiritual or the divine in some way that you don't do that any other time. I grew up in a tradition where parents told their children not to run in church. Well, what they were doing is they were acknowledging sacred space. This isn't the playground. This isn't the place, even though it may not be a complete place of complete silence, it's still, there's some reverence that's supposed to accompany being in that space that isn't everywhere else. And so you'll see this is true oftentimes in any place. If you walk into a mosque or a Buddhist temple or a Hindu space, oftentimes there's a sense of reverence, a sense of decorum to that. So sacred space is, that space can be geographical. The Jewish tradition has this concept of the Holy Land, of the promised land that was promised to their ancestor Abraham in the book of Genesis. That can be geographical. That can be topographical. Means high places, some place that is high up and that is, like a sacred mountain, or it can be places that are that's going to be low places that are down in the valley or up on the mountaintop. Oftentimes sacred spaces are going to be on a mountaintop because that's closer to the heavens and closer to the gods. And that's why you'll create the sacred space to have to go to a high place that's closer to the gods in that regard. It can be environmental. Oftentimes where elements of nature come together can be referred to as what's called a thin place. Thin meaning the barrier between the human and the spiritual world, that is somewhat thin at that point. And thin places historically and throughout the world can be where, say, the water, where the land meets the sea, the shoreline, or where the earth meets the sky. Or it could be on edges of mysterious forests, places of mystery where you don't know what actually is going to happen inside, and so people consider those forests to be possibly haunted or have spirits there. So that's a thin place where elements of the nature come together. But also sacred space can be architectural, and meaning that once a community, a culture decides they want to designate space specifically for ritual or religious use, architecture seems to arise out of that, to designate one space different from another. And that's where your churches, your mosques, your temples come into play. That's where pyramids of the ancient world come into play. That's whether it's going to be a pyramid that's going to be used for burial use, say in ancient Egypt, or if it's going to be used for ritual use, say the ziggurats of ancient Sumer, or even the Maya and Aztec pyramids that you see in the New World. Because not only is it sacred space as opposed to every other common space, but it also winds up being topographically almost an artificial mountain where you climb a high place to meet the gods at the top of it. So that's sacred space. And that's a long explanation, but it's something once you see it, you can't unsee it. it becomes obvious everywhere you go. Like, okay, that sacred space can be environmental, it can be geographical, it can be topographical, and oftentimes it's architectural. Specifically, people are going to design and create spaces, and oftentimes they'll be ornate and artistic, and all sorts of architectural skill and sculpture and artistry will go into designating that space as being better than other places. Now I want to talk about sacred times. Now, sacred times, like there can be sacred time, yes, because time is always going on, but typically religions will designate certain times that are for ritual use to happen, things that happen on certain days, certain times of the day. So, for example, if there's a commemorative event that it happens annually or regularly, once a year, that during a winter solstice or a summer solstice, or the sun is hitting something specifically at the right time, that's where a ritual can take place. And so the sacred space answers the question of where. The sacred times answers the question of when. And that those times can be annual, they can be lunar, they can be monthly, and they can be associated with any sort of natural phenomenon. Oftentimes, because of the rising and the setting of the sun, many cultures will have specific services that happen exactly at sunrise and exactly at sunset because of the phenomenon, the awe-inspiring phenomenon of the sun rising and the sun setting. In ancient Egypt, there was believed that the sun, when it goes under the earth, it's constantly warring with chaos, the gods of chaos. The sun god is warring with the gods of chaos. And so every time the sun arose, we were thankful that somehow that the sun went out again and the world wasn't destroyed. So there were sunrise and sunset services because the prayers at sunset were like, oh goodness, here we go again. The night holds all sorts of dangers of possible calamities. So there's you see morning and evening sacrifice in ancient Hebrew tradition. I see that from the Bible. But many, and that carries over into many Christian traditions as well. But nevertheless, there are sacred times that happen either daily, they can happen weekly. The Muslim tradition, oftentimes regular prayer services happen on Friday. For Jewish tradition, oftentimes those services will be happening on Saturday. That's related to Saturday being the Sabbath day. That's set apart as sacred in Jewish tradition. For many Christians, the sacred day is Sunday, and that's commemorative because of the foundational Christian story of Jesus of Nazareth being crucified on Friday, but on Sunday morning he rises from the dead. And so to commemorate that was how the tradition began, of always happening. If the Jewish tradition was to worship on the last day of the week, the Christian tradition became to worship on the first day of the week, which was Sunday. But nevertheless, that's a reoccurring sacred time that happens weekly. But throughout religion, there will be specific sacred times that happen annually. So such as Ramadan in the Muslim tradition, or in the Christian tradition, there's Christmas and Easter and other things in the religious calendar. So most Americans are familiar with Christmas and Easter, but in many Christian traditions throughout the world, there's a whole calendar of traditions related to starting with Advent, which is a time that builds up to Christmastide, and then Christmas, and then Epiphany, and then a Lent season, a time of preparation leading up to Easter, and then you have Easter time, and then Pentecost, and then a whole series of events and possible services that are related to the memory of certain saints that happen throughout the year. But in essence, there's a whole Christian calendar of a full year full of different rituals and sacred times that happen to designate things in their past. So you always want to keep track of the fact that most religions have sacred times of some type. Now, let's go into sacred rites. Sacred rites are those practices that are specifically designed for engaging the spiritual or the divine. They're not like everything you do the rest of the time. People will oftentimes say, well, isn't that kind of a Western notion that you have sacred times, but the rest of the time is just for yourself? I mean, don't many other cultures many other cultures integrate their spiritual understanding into the rest of what they do? Indeed, they do, and that is a good critique to look at what's referred to as Cartesian dualisms of spiritual and material, and realize in the West we've invented a new separation of spiritual and material life that really doesn't exist in times past and in throughout the world now. So it's a really good critique. Nevertheless, even people in the ancient world understood certain rites are specifically for engaging the spirit, the supernatural or the divine, or even deceased ancestors. They specifically enable us to do that are distinct from everyday chores. So even in my research in ancient Mexico or in Peru or South America or in Asia, there are still going to be practices that help depend on psychologically. If you want to approach this from a psychosocial perspective, you could say that those rites help focus the mind and help people think specifically about the forces that they're in, the other than human forces that they're engaging in. But that's something of a forensic psychological approach. I think that sometimes there's some benefit to that, but I think just think about it as people go through various different protocols to demonstrate the respect and reverence and approach and the manner in which they need to approach these other than human forces. Just about everything, considered ways in which we do that for any area where we want to show reverence. If you go to Washington, D.C., you go into, say, you go to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Washington, D.C. It's Arlington National Cemetery. And there are guards that walk around the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in a very specific manner. They walk a certain pace. They inspect one another's gear and their uniforms and each other's weapon in a manner of the changing of the guard. And it's a ceremony that many people like to witness when they go to Washington, D.C., because it's full of reverence. It's very it's silence. You really have to stay away from that space, and most spectators, most tourists, know to show it the reverence and respect that it warrants, regardless of whether or not you've learned much about that history, or even think what do you think of the military. There's still a certain amount of reverence that goes into witnessing the changing of the guard at Arlington, at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Well, those are sacred rites in a sense that places everybody in the proper mindset and the manner. And it's not just them that are engaging in the ritual. Everybody witnessing the ritual understands the gravity of the situation because of what they watch unfold. So rites are those rituals that we use to engage those other than human forces, the deceased ancestors, the spiritual forces about us, or the divine, the gods, or God. However, everybody does it. No one is exempt. People will say, well, I don't engage in any sort of rituals, and or if a person has any sort of religious at all that is highly ritualized. I do interact with people sometimes who will say go to various different churches in some Christian tradition in America, and they will claim not to be highly ritualized. That's because they're trying to juxtapose themselves to, say, a Roman Catholic or a Greek Orthodox service that is very symbolic, and has a great deal of ancient pageantry to it. And I'll say to them, no, you are just highly ritualized in some other manner. If anyone does anything wrong or does something odd or not what you're used to, you will notice. And it will be somewhat of a scandal when everyone notices that you changed something and wonder, why they changed that much? Is that what's happening to our organization now? So sacred rites are that manner in which you go about encountering the divine, the supernatural. And again, like I said, everybody does it. Even in a secular capacity, everybody does that. Probably the most famous non-religious or secular state of the 20th century was the Soviet Union. It was Marxism is fundamentally atheist, and so the Marxist tradition of the Soviet Union was to be atheist, was to acknowledge no God at all except the state. And yet everything about them was highly ritualized. So from when the May Day parades that went through Red Square to the manner in which people were reverent and showed their appreciation around the tomb of Lenin. I mean, everything was highly ritualized. And so ritual really isn't something we can escape. It's something we do as humans all the time. So there are sacred rites that every culture engages in. Now, sacred offices. Sacred offices are, what I mean by that is, those holding sacred office are the designated individuals that are tasked with specifically knowing what to do, knowing how we should conduct ourselves in sacred space, when are the sacred times in which we should conduct our rituals. They're tasked with knowing the rituals that we need to do in order to approach the supernatural or the divine at all. We designate a individual aside and say, here, you remember how to do this, remember when to do it and why we do it. And because not everybody can be expected to know the same thing all the time. So we set apart remember, it's a sacred offices or sacred things are set apart for ritual or divine use. Those holding sacred office are individuals set apart for that use. They're set apart to know things the rest of us don't have to know all the time. They're set apart to know things about the gods, the supernatural, the ancestors. They're set apart to remember how do we access the ancestors of our tribe, the ancestors that we want to glean wisdom from. They're set apart to know how do we access the divine and what are the protocols for going about that. These aren't just individuals who know things. Oftentimes, because they hold sacred office, they embody much of the sacred, and we treat them differently than everybody else. In the Roman Catholic tradition, these individuals, priests, are so set apart that they aren't even allowed to marry, lest they be unduly shared with a family when they really need to be fully dedicated to the church. So those holding sacred office are, basically, it's within a group. If you were to invent a religion, out of whole cloth, you still would find yourself designating individuals to remember, that had to remember what we need to do, remember why we do it, when we do it, where we do it, and they would also eventually embody that sense of the sacred too, such that we're oddly closer to the divine or the supernatural when we're closer to them. And people oftentimes, again, traditions will say, well, I'm part of a religious tradition, but we don't really have priests, so we don't really have a sacred office. I'm like, really? Well, when you were last in the hospital, who did you ask to come visit you? Well, my pastor, of course. Or people say, I don't have a pastor. We just basically do everything, we just have a community of people that we, have in our home. Really? Is there a person that seemingly is repeatedly asked to pray for the food? Or the person who specifically asked to pray for you when some calamity arises? Humans naturally will designate an individual that's set apart for specific use to know specific things, and they'll typically oftentimes even embody that in some way. So sacred offices, ubiquitous throughout religious. Now, sacred objects. Sacred objects are also throughout all religious cultures, because the way in which the spiritual interacts with the material, again, that's get away from. Sacred objects can be architectural, but they can be portable. They can be too big to move, and isolated by themselves. You'll see like totem poles within the Native American Northwest. You may see monuments of different types like Stonehenge. You may see different things that are embedded within architecture, but they're also sacred objects, can be just something that is a small reminder of what everyone believes, or it's even if it's not used in divine use. You'll see above me here some of my memorabilia from Mexico that are small figurines of reminding of the various different gods in ancient Mexico. But those are just those are small little objects. Other sacred objects are used in ritual use. I mean, the certain Christian traditions process a cross down the middle, use it in the middle of their worship time. That's a sacred object. Other traditions will hold something that is, it could be incense, it could be certain lights, something that produces candles. These also are sacred objects as well, because they are not just for everyday use. They're specifically used within the context of that interaction with the supernatural or the divine. So sacred objects are inescapable. And again, like I said, I come from a tradition that early on, I came from a tradition that claimed that they didn't have sacred objects. And like, really? Okay, yeah, no, they'd say we don't have sacred objects like rosary beads or any sort of amulets like, those primitive people do. Like, really? Okay. So in that lecture, in that classroom setting, I had a Bible and I tossed it across the room to somebody, and they gasped accordingly. Like, they were absolutely mortified that I would treat a Bible that way. Like, well, we do have sacred objects, actually, because the Bible is important to many people. I mean, specifically as the Quran is, or the Torah is in Jewish traditions. It's not just those books don't just contain a revelation from the divine. They take on a sacred component to it all by themselves. And that's why people, if they do own a Bible, it typically doesn't look like other books. It'll be leather bound with gold leaf on the pages. I mean, it's a sacred object. And I tell people, I'll say, don't apologize for that. Own it. I mean, it really is something that you treat differently than other things. And so it's any sort of object, though. It doesn't have to be a book. It can be anything. It could be a cross the person holds dear to them. It could be a wristband. It could be a bracelet. It could be anything that reminds you of your faith in such a way that is not for everyday use. So ancient cultures would do this with the same thing with a sacrificial knife or sacrificial altar or anything that is you think, well, that could possibly be used for some other use, but there's something about it archaeologically. You can look at that material and go, it could be used for everyday use, but in everyday use, it's somewhat impractical to use something so ornate, so artistic. It's probably set apart for ritual use, and so sacred objects. Now, again, sacred objects can be huge and architectural, but they can also be small and portable as well. But now the last thing, sacred myths. So we talked about sacred space, sacred times, sacred offices, sacred objects, and sacred myths. Now, what I mean by a myth, M-Y-T-H, I don't mean a myth in the sense of that's a myth, that story's a myth, meaning it's not true. Anthropologists oftentimes will talk about myths as something that's important, an important story, the big story, a story that's so big and so important that it's mythological, is take on mythic proportions, and to that extent, now the actual small detail facts about the story somewhat are eclipsed by the importance of the story. Because what are you supposed to get from that story? The small details and facts of the story? Or are you supposed to get a moral from that story? Are you supposed to get some aspect of faith to that story? Many things about American history could be told factually, but oftentimes if they're told factually, in some sort of rather forensic manner, they get too boring in order for someone to keep up with them. So what they'll do is that you take that same story and it becomes mythological in order to get that better understanding of that. So that's oftentimes what I tell people about movies. There's a few things more annoying to me. This is just like a side note. A few things more annoying to me than someone who says, well, I saw that movie, but that was, it was not factual with regard to something related to a science fiction film, or someone will say, well, that could never happen. Like, I think you're missing the point. Oftentimes when something's been made into a film, it's a mythological telling of that story. It's meant to teach a moral of that story, or give you some sense of awe of people's sacrifice or people's struggles, rather than trying to just give you straight facts, which can be boring and you wouldn't pay attention to that anyway. So, and as case in point, for many people do enjoy documentaries, but more people enjoy action films. So a documentary is fine, but most often if you're going to tell a story specifically of a historic character, you're going to need to tell it in a manner that's compelling, that gives the big story, that gives the big message out of it. So therefore, every religion has sacred myths. And by something becoming so mythological, there's different myths within that serve different purposes. There are origin myths, how the world began. There's personal tribal origin myths, how your people began. There's ascension myths, how certain leaders came to be. There are expansion myths, how your people grew and expanded over time. There can be even redemption myths, how one character would have suffered some sort of setback or some sort of tragedy, but then arose after that. But in almost all cultures, specifically in the main monotheisms of the world, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, there's what I refer to as a crux myth. Now, what's a crux myth? CRUX. What's a crux myth? Well, I borrowed that term from my old days rock climbing, in which a person would climb a mountain or climb a hill, and oftentimes there's what's referred to as a crux move. And the crux move is that move where if a person has to get past that move has to get past that rock climbing move in order to access the rest of the mountain. And so climbers will oftentimes talk about the crux move here is, 20 feet up that pitch, and if you can't get past it, that's as high as you're going to go. But you have to get past that in order to access the rest of the mountain. So I borrow that term to talk about a crux myth. And the crux myth for many cultures is the myth upon which all of the myths depend. If that myth for some reason falls apart, or if it was proven to be untrue in some way, then the rest of it falls apart too. So the crux myth is the myth upon all other myths depend. So religions will have this. Specifically, the monotheisms have this. For Islam, the crux myth is the revelation of God to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel when the word was dictated to him. So that's the crux myth. If for some reason someone doesn't believe that crux myth, then the rest of it falls apart, because the morality of Islam, the various other teachings of Islam, all depend upon whether or not God spoke to the Prophet Muhammad. For Judaism, the crux myth is the Exodus. If you see the movie The Ten Commandments or anything related to Moses, that myth, that big story of the Hebrews being selected by God and liberated from slavery in Egypt and brought into their new land, contained in the story in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament in Hebrew Bible, that is the crux myth, because that's what makes them a special people. That's what develops the covenant by which they can do everything else later on can depend. So that's the crux myth. So without that, everything else falls apart. Why in the world will you go exclusively to that religion for things related to morality and access to God, and all the ways in which you bring your people together? For Christianity, the crux myth is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The moral teaching, any sort of tribal teaching, any sort of teaching related to how society is supposed to be ordered, all of that is secondary. The crux myth is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And within the pages of the Bible even makes this argument that all things, every other myth depends upon it, so that Christians at the very least believe that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified on Friday and then was dead, didn't pass out, he was dead, and then on Sunday morning he rose again and emerged from the tomb alive. So that's the crux myth of Christianity. And within the internal pages of the New Testament, the writers make that case that if Christ isn't raised, then your faith is vain. So nevertheless, religions have a crux myth. They'll have various different myths that are all related to that, but they will have a crux myth. And so these sacred myths, of various different levels, whether it's the crux myth or whether it's redemption myths or expansion myths or whether it's origin myths, all these will wind up having some sort of manifestation in sacred rites. So what we're talking about now is, when we talk about the sacred space, sacred times, rites, offices, objects, and myths, these actually wind up winding and interweaving together. So it's typically this big story, one of the foundational myths of a religion, that will dictate where you're going to interact with the supernatural or the divine. Those myths determine where. That's your sacred space. They're going to determine when. That's your sacred times. Those myths are going to say something about what rites you're going to perform, because the rites that you perform somehow will rehearse and reestablish and recapitulate the myths. The rites themselves remind you about everything that you believe about those myths. whether it's ancestral or tribal or universal. And the objects, the offices that those designated for sacred office, they're the ones who have to remember the sacred myths and remember the sacred myths and why what we do is attached to them, and why you use sacred objects. I mean, in Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant was a major sacred object. Well, what makes the Ark of the Covenant a sacred object? Well, the myths of the Old Testament that tell you that it's a sacred object. And so that's why these things are all bound together. So all the myths basically are the backing for why you do what you do, whether it's at the tribal or personal, tribal or universal level. Now, let me say a few words about the in-group or how that is maintained within a community. The community is able to have these things in common, and they understand them so well that as part of what identifies you as within the community is that you have all these things in common. You just, you're there with someone else, and they believe the same myths you do, and they typically meet at the same time you do. They engage the same sacred times, rites. We have the same approach toward the same people holding sacred office and so forth. And so what it does is it forms kind of a normative set of beliefs and practices. And if you're going to, I have a graph here to put up on your screen that shows like a normative way of engaging all these things. Now, if something's normative, that means any deviation from that is by definition deviant. So the normative deviant is kind of like a horizontal axis on a graph. But there's different ways in which things are engaged in a religion. If those practices and myths and all those elements of the sacred are engaged at the official level by an official, if that's an official, a designated individual, then we would refer to that sometimes as official religion, because the official religion is when the whole community comes together and they are doing everything together, and it's being led by officials, oftentimes that have been designated within the community. Sometimes they're even supported by the local government, as we see, say, with ancient Aztecs or Maya, or even religious officials, say, like in the Roman Catholic Church or anything else where the organization that has become somewhat formalized. So there's the official religion where it's being conducted from the top down, but there's also the religion that people do on their own, at the popular level. So, because not everything that everyone does on their own is exactly as it was taught at the official level. So popular religion can differ a little bit. A good example in the Christian religion, a good example is official religion is what happens at church, versus popular religion is what a person does at home. So official religion may be, say, the teaching that happens on Sunday morning, but the popular religion may be how a person reads their Bible or engages or prays on their own time, in their own space. Well, in the Muslim tradition, the official religion may obviously be a Friday prayer service, and that's obviously sacred space where people come together for that gathering. But what would be popular religion for the Muslim? Well, of course, that's going to be a prayer rug where you're going to be facing east and you're going to be praying several times a day in the manner that you are taught, in the manner that you remember how to. So that happens at the individual level. So popular religion and official religion, that affects just about every religious culture as well. Sometimes there's tremendous congruence between those, where what a person does on their own time is very much, closely adheres to what they were taught at the official level. But not always. Sometimes there can be differences between those. And if you think about it like a grid, what I refer to as a religion grid of normative, official, popular, normative, and deviant, that winds up creating almost like a movable target where you can pinpoint. When you observe something in a religion, you can kind of go, wait a second, what am I observing right now? Am I observing something that's official at the that's normative and official, or something that's normative and popular? Or am I observing something that is deviant and popular? Or am I observing something right now that's actually official and deviant? This is going to cause some sort of fracturing in the community. So that helps you think about religion as a whole. Now, I share all that to say this. As you engage engage the material for the course, but also go out into the world, it's important you have those sophisticated categories with which to think about religion and engage other people. Not only think about your own religious tradition this way, but engaging other people as well, starting those conversations, and it should better equip you to not just to make friends, build bridges, and be more effective in the marketplace when you are in talking with other people that have a different a religious tradition than yours. All right. So that was that's just to help you with your work through your assignments and think about the material for the course this way, and it's for your benefit. Have a good night.